Right here, I am holding the cheapest pair of football boots that Nike sells. These are the Phantom GX2 Club Edition. And they retail for just $55, which is a staggering $200 cheaper than the top tier elite version. But just because these boots are cheap, you shouldn't write them off yet, because as we'll discuss in this video, they actually have a surprising amount going for them. So sit down, relax, and let's talk about the Phantom GX2 Club. And as always, if you're interested in picking up a pair after watching the video, you can find links to them on sale with exclusive discount codes in the description below. So let's start things off as we usually do, talking about the design. Now from top to bottom, the design of this club model is completely different to the top tier elite Phantom GX2. And considering the price difference between those boots, it shouldn't come as much of a surprise. Let's start with the upper here, where instead of Nike's classic grip knit material, you're actually going to get a variation of a material called Nike Skin. Now this material is going to be very different from grip knit, which has a sticky, almost web-like texture to it. This Nike Skin that you have on the club model is still going to be a little bit grippy and have some texture to it, but it's not going to have nearly as much stickiness as you get from the real grip knit material that's on the premium version. But that being said, while the material isn't quite as grippy, you are still going to get these rounded textured elements that go out in concentric circles, which is a feature that you find on the more expensive versions. So it's cool that Nike did include that on the club version instead of just making a more basic matte material. You actually get a cool variety of textures throughout the upper on this club model. As I mentioned, it is going to be a little bit more sticky in this white area, and then as it transitions in the middle of the midfoot and towards the heel, it gets a little bit more matte and has more of a slick finish to it. Then moving on to the center of the boot here, instead of that mesh one-piece upper that you get on the premium version, instead you're just going to have a traditional tongue here. Now the tongue here isn't the most premium, but it does its job and it allows for a little bit more width and flexibility throughout the midfoot. Then at the back of the boot and around the ankle area, you are going to get a relatively soft mesh heel liner. And then flipping over to the outsole, we're going to see even more variations between this model and the premium version with pretty much a completely different sole plate. And the first thing that I like about this variation of the sole plate is that to me, it actually seems like it tapers slightly less compared to the Cyclone configuration that's on the premium model. And that more subtle tapering towards the toe box means that the fit will actually be a little bit better for those with wide feet. Then moving on to the stud configuration, where the premium version has a Cyclone circular pattern towards the top of the forefoot here, the club version takes a completely different approach with these more subtle rounded off studs and then two more angular rectangle shaped studs towards the top of the toe box. To me, I actually prefer this stud pattern so much more to what's featured on the more expensive versions, because that Cyclone pattern was advertised to reduce rotational traction and potentially make it easier to spin on your forefoot, but when I tested out those boots, I didn't notice that effect at all, and I haven't really seen any science from Nike to actually back up that Cyclone pattern is going to do what it's intended to do. Whereas I think the stud configuration you get with this club version here is actually going to be a lot more versatile, and it's going to be appropriate for use on both firm ground surfaces and artificial grass. And that makes sense because this boot is advertised for use on MG or multi-ground, which means it's intended to be used on a variety of surfaces. So overall, I'm really impressed with the design. One tweak I would have liked to have seen is just a little bit more flex towards the midfoot. I think the sole plate is just suffering from being a bit too rigid here, which can make it a little bit more awkward when you're walking or running and your foot tends to bend naturally, but that's probably the only major change I would make. Now let's get into what these boots were like on feet in terms of the fit and feel. So the first thing I immediately noticed about these club versions here is that they were so easy to slip on and off. And that's something I've noticed with all of the lower price models from Nike, especially the Academy versions. Because they have this open traditional lacing system, they're so easy to slide on and off. And another theme I noticed with these boots that's similar to other affordable Nike options is that they just feel a little bit more relaxed on feet. And I think that that's another symptom of the fact that they have this traditional lacing system that allows for a little bit more openness, and it just isn't quite as claustrophobic as the more snug fitting elite version. Now, some people really like like that close, streamlined fit, and it can come down to personal preference, but because I have pretty wide feet, especially when getting into Nikes, I actually like that I have a little bit more adjustability and width. Now, in terms of sizing, I got these in my standard 10.5 US, and the length was perfect, giving me just about a half centimeter or so at the end of the toe box. Now, I would say the width on these boots are relatively average, maybe slightly on the narrower side of average since they are still Nikes, which tends to be a brand that runs a little bit on the slim side. That being said, if you fit well in boots like the Tiempo Legend 10, I would say you would also fit well into the Phantoms here. But one important note I want to mention regarding the width is that to me, these club versions here definitely felt like they offered a little bit more room at the front of the boot compared to the Elite versions. So if you previously wrote off the Phantoms for being a bit too narrow, these cheaper versions might actually offer you a better fit. And as I mentioned, you are going to have more adjustability through that traditional lacing system. So if you want to keep the boots a little bit more loose towards the toe box area, you can do that while you keep them a little bit more snug towards the ankle area. Now, the lockdown in these boots was absolutely great. I think that the lace holes at the sides of the boot here were perfectly positioned to give you a lot of security through the top of the foot. And I also found that the heel area was sufficiently deep enough to give you a lot of security, which is an issue that some takedown models from other brands actually really struggle with, specifically some takedowns from Adidas in the past. I find that for whatever reason, they can just be really shallow throughout the ankle and heel area. So no matter how tight you get the laces, your foot is always kind of getting the sensation that it's slipping out the back of the boots. Whereas with these Nikes, they feel really comfortable, snug, and secure. So front to back, I thought these boots were really comfortable on feet. There was no pressure points that I noticed in the heel area or the toe box. And the only final thing I'd want to note is that these boots are going to be a little bit more cushioned on feet compared to those more expensive versions, but they're not going to feel overly chunky in any way. And next up, let's get into what these boots were like to play in. So considering these boots have such a different design to the premium model, it's not surprising that they also felt pretty different to play in. To start off, the upper, as I mentioned, is going to be a lot less sticky compared to the grip knit that you get on that Elite version. And for me, I actually liked that feature because with the Elite model, sometimes, especially when they're fresh out of the box, it feels like the touches on the ball just almost get stuck under your feet. There's almost a little bit too much grip for my liking, whereas with boots like this that have a slightly more matte coating, I actually think the upper has a really good balance of stickiness here, so it has a little bit of grip without going overboard. I find it easier to get more directional touches out of your feet without being too grippy. Now, the only thing that you're gonna miss is that with the Elite versions, because you have so much grip, it does help with those whipped and curled in shots where you can get a lot of spin on the ball. But that being said, you're still gonna get just enough traction with the club version here. And at the end of the day, getting curl and spin on your shots and passes is going to come down to 90% technique and then maybe only 5 to 10% the boots that you're wearing. But another thing I really liked about playing in the Phantoms here is that the upper didn't really seem to bunch up that much when I was running around, which I was pretty surprised by because that's a very common thing to see in cheaper synthetic models, especially the boot I recently reviewed here in the Puma Ultra Match. This boot I found bunched up a lot when I was running around and caused a little bit of discomfort towards the top of the foot. And keep in mind, these are actually more expensive than the GX2 club version I have here. The upper felt pretty soft on feet, and it actually has a decent amount of flex to it, so it doesn't bunch up in any one area, and when you're running, it doesn't feel like the upper is too rigid or constraining. And another thing I like is that the upper is actually thin enough to give you a good deal of sensitivity, so whether you're dribbling, juggling, or shooting the ball, you actually get a lot of connection when you're striking it. In other words, the upper isn't quite as thick and bulky compared to some other cheap models from Nike, such as the Tiempo Legend 10 Academy, which while I really like that boot, the upper is a little bit on the thicker side and doesn't give you as much sensitivity as the Phantom clubs here. And finally, the sole plate on the clubs here handled everything really well. I was testing these boots out on firm ground natural grass, and whether I was getting ready to take off into a sprint or just change directions, I got a lot of traction and responsiveness from the sole plate without it feeling like it was getting stuck in the ground. Next up, let's talk about value. As I mentioned to kick off the video, the Phantom GX2 Club are one of the cheapest boots you can get from Nike, retailing for just $55. That puts them at Nike's 4th takedown level tier, which is the lowest that they go. Above that, there's the Academy version, which usually goes for around $80 to $90, then the Pro version, which sits around $130 to $140, and finally the Elites that can be as much as $260. And guess what? The Club versions is the only model where you're gonna get this MG sole plate, which I think is better than the sole plates on all of the more expensive versions. So of course I'm gonna say that the Club versions here have really good value. And these boots just go to show that sometimes simple is better, and oftentimes when you're spending more money to get a more expensive boot, you're not always getting a better fit, a better feel. Sometimes you're just getting more gimmicky features. So to someone who has a budget on the lower side that's closer to $50 or $60, I would be happy to recommend boots like this. And whether they intended to or not, I think Nike stumbled upon making an amazing value proposition with all of their Club versions. Now let's talk about what competitors might be out there to the GX2 Club. Now, one of the most direct competitors to this model is probably going to be the Academy version of the same boot, which is the 3rd tier takedown, where this is going to be the 4th tier takedown. Now, the Academy version is going to have a slightly stickier upper, and it's going to have a revised sole plate that's going to have that Cyclone configuration. But the Academy version is going to retail for $90 US, which in my opinion is just overpriced for a 3rd tier takedown, whereas the Club is much more reasonably priced, around 55 bucks. So honestly, I think for $40 less, the Club version just makes so much more sense. Now, however, if you were willing to bump your budget up a little bit, close to that $80 price point, there are some great options to consider. For example, the Vapor 15 Academy from Nike, that in my opinion is going to be the best budget speed boot you can get. It was one of my favorite boots that I got to try on last year. And if you're considering that really thin minimalist feel from a cheaper football boot, that's definitely one I would want to point out. And then if you want a boot with a slightly wider fit than the GX2 Club here, you could look at the Tiempo Legend 10 Academy from Nike. That is going to be a synthetic that mimics the feel of leather. It's actually going to have a really similar tongue and heel liner to the Club GXs here, but it's going to have just a little bit more space throughout the midfoot and the top of the boot, and a little bit more of a comfortable fit. And then if you were able to stretch your budget all the way up to that $100 price point, I would also recommend checking out the Copa Gloro from Adidas or the Nike Premier 3. They're going to be really comfortable, full leather upper football boots that offer a ton of value. They're two of my favorite budget leather football boots you can get. But nevertheless, at that $50 to $55 price point, these are going to be so hard to beat. So what are my final thoughts? Well, if you're looking for an affordable football boot that has all of the features of the fancy $260 Phantom GX2, you're not gonna find them here. But guess what? Not all of the features in that expensive model are actually worth it. So if you're just looking for a comfortable, pretty good looking boot for under $60, the GX2 Club is gonna be a great option. And that is gonna do it for this video. As always, let me know if you've gotten the chance to try on these boots and what you think of them. Like and subscribe if you've enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one.